In 1894, deep within the Ozark Mountains, whispers spread about a root that could call the dead back from the soil. Midwives guarded its secret for generations, performing rituals the townsfolk were too afraid to speak of. Tonight, you'll hear what truly happened in those woods, and why no one dares to gather herbs there anymore. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Somewhere quiet, or somewhere the wind still moves through the trees like it remembers? They warned anyone in the village to never cross Hollow Creek after dark. Mothers would clutch their children tighter. Men would pause mid-step on the forest path, and the elderly would shake their heads, as if speaking aloud could summon what should remain hidden. Yet, on a storm-laden evening in 1894, I found myself standing at the water's edge, lantern in hand, listening to the creek gurgle under the weight of falling rain. The air was thick, not just with fog, but with something older, something that belonged to the trees and the soil and the roots that curled across the forest floor. I had come in search of a root, whispered about in hushed voices, avoided in kitchens, and recorded only in fragile journals hidden behind wooden doors. It was said to have power over life and death, a secret so carefully guarded that those who spoke of it too openly rarely lived to repeat their tale. I held the lantern closer, feeling the heat of its flame against the chill that seeped from the creek. The forest seemed to shift with each heartbeat, the branches overhead bending as if to peer down at me. And then the question settled over me like a second skin. What could drive someone to risk everything for a single root, a piece of the earth itself that was said to hold the knowledge of those long gone? Even now, decades later, I can feel that pull, that moment when curiosity crossed a threshold, and something in the forest recognized it. And I knew, in that instant, that there was no turning back. The night, the creek, and the forest had claimed me, if only for a while, and they had begun to whisper their story. The forest around Hollow Creek was not merely dark. It was dense in a way that made every sound echo longer, every shadow linger with intention. The trees arched high above me, their thick trunks wrapped in moss, the bark slick with rain. Leaves dripped steadily, the droplets striking the soil like slow percussion. Each breath I drew carried the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something older, something rooted deeper than memory. The wind moved in whispers, threading through the branches, stirring the fog that clung to the ground. It was as if the forest itself was breathing, patient and watchful. I stepped carefully along the narrow path, feeling the roots twist underfoot, like fingers pressing from the soil. My lantern flickered, casting long, uneven shadows that stretched between the trees and shifted as though alive. Signs of the midwives' work became visible even in the dim light. Small bundles of herbs were arranged in precise clusters, tied with twine or hidden under moss. Stones, blackened with old fire, formed imperfect circles around depressions in the soil. Each arrangement felt intentional, almost reverential, as if it had been left not for protection alone, but as a message. I could sense the presence of those who had been there before me, kneeling, tending the roots, murmuring to the soil as if it could hear their words. I paused at the edge of a clearing, listening. The creek murmured in the distance, the mist curling over the roots and ferns. There was no one there, yet the air carried a weight, an awareness that I was being observed. Every instinct urged caution, every fiber of my being told me to turn away. And yet the root called to me, faint but insistent, promising knowledge, danger, and something that could not be ignored. I pressed further into the forest, the fog thickening with every step. Branches arched overhead, forming tunnels that obscured the sky, and the air grew colder, heavier, carrying faint traces of herbs and burnt wood. A small clearing revealed the first unmistakable evidence of ritual. Herbs were arranged in concentric circles, and the earth at the center appeared almost blackened, as though holding memory in its soil. As I knelt to examine the plants, I heard it. A subtle rustling in the underbrush, deliberate, calculated. I held my breath, telling myself it was only the wind or a small animal. But then came a soft tap, a shift in the mist, and my lantern trembled in my hand. Something had moved just beyond the edge of my vision. I dared not look directly, yet I could feel it. The forest was alive with attention. The stories from the village returned in vivid clarity. Livestock disappearing and returning with strange, glassy eyes. Children wandering into the woods for hours, coming back changed. Elderly villagers recounting glimpses of figures kneeling in fog, tending to the roots, murmuring to the soil. Each account seemed impossible by daylight, yet here, under the low clouds and twisting trees, they pressed upon me with weight. I stepped lightly, careful not to disturb the forest further. My heart thudded with each footfall as shadows moved at the edges of my lantern's glow. Shapes that could have been human, could have been tree limbs, or could have been something older, fleeting, and watching. The fog pulsed around me, curling like slow fingers toward my legs, and I realized that my curiosity was no longer private. It had been noticed, and perhaps welcomed, or judged, by something in the forest. I stopped in a small depression, the root's faint glow visible just beyond the mist. It pulsed, almost imperceptibly, like it remembered me from the instant I entered. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest and ears. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every thought urged me forward. I was caught between the fear of what I might see and the desire to uncover the secret the midwives had guarded for decades. Then came a sound that made me still. Not a rustle, not a snap, but a faint vibration underfoot. The forest seemed to respond to my presence, moving subtly, almost in rhythm with my heartbeat. I knew, without doubt, that the root, the rituals, the forest itself, was aware of me. And that knowledge settled in my chest like cold stone. I had crossed a threshold, one from which I might not return unchanged. I reached the center of the clearing, the place where the forbidden root lay twisted across the damp earth. It was larger than I had imagined, knotted and gnarled, almost coiling around itself like a sleeping creature. Its surface glimmered faintly, wet and dark, reflecting the flickering light of my lantern in patterns that seemed almost intentional, as if the root were watching, acknowledging me. Around it were the remnants of rituals carried out over decades. Stones arranged in imperfect circles, blackened by fires long extinguished. Herbs bound with thread, moss, and sinew, forming shapes I could not decipher, but instinctively understood to be protective, sacred, or perhaps warnings. Each item felt alive with memory, as if the very soil and wood and leaves had recorded every act performed here. And then I saw them, figures kneeling at the edge of my vision, robed and hooded, tending to invisible fires, murmuring words I could not hear. When I blinked, they were gone. A chill crawled over my spine as I realized they were never fully gone, only waiting, existing in some fold of perception I could not hold. The forest seemed to pulse with their presence, every shadow a reminder that I was being observed, measured, considered. I stepped closer, compelled by curiosity and dread alike. The root pulsed again, a faint vibration traveling through the soil and into my bones. My lantern trembled in my hand. The wind shifted in subtle, deliberate patterns, carrying scents of herbs, smoke, and something darker, older than memory itself. The sounds of the forest, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, became rhythmic, almost deliberate, orchestrated in ways I could feel more than hear. And then came the unmistakable shift. The earth beneath my feet quivered slightly, and a faint glow appeared at the base of the root, a pale, almost phosphorescent light that seemed to breathe. It pulsed slowly, deliberately, in rhythm with some invisible heartbeat. My fingers itched to touch it, to discover whether the stories, the warnings, the whispered secrets were true. But every instinct screamed caution. For a long moment I simply knelt, observing, listening, feeling the weight of centuries pressing in. The forest had remembered every hand that had reached for the root, every ritual performed, every life it had touched. And now it remembered me. That alone was enough to make my chest tighten and my vision narrow. A realization that some secrets are guarded not by men, but by the living memory of the earth itself. I moved closer to the clusters of herbs, bending to examine the arrangements more closely. Each bundle was meticulously tied with thread, moss, or strips of cloth, and each carried the scent of decay and damp earth. Some leaves were blackened at the edges, scorched by fire or ritual. Others were still faintly green, preserved against the damp. I recalled the journals I had glimpsed in the village, written by apprentices and midwives alike. They spoke of careful, precise rituals, water from Hollow Creek mixed with specific herbs, circles drawn in ash to mark boundaries, chants whispered to awaken the dormant energy of the root. Every action was deliberate, protective, reverent. They were not acts of superstition. They were acts of respect for forces the villagers understood far better than I ever could. As I read the instructions, I felt a chill press against my back, a soft rustle, a deliberate snapping of twigs in the distance. I looked, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Shapes moved in the fog just beyond the lantern's glow, indistinct yet purposeful. I realized that even in my careful observation, I had intruded upon something alive, something aware. The root pulsed again beneath the soil, and I felt the vibration up through my fingers and into my chest. It was alive in a way that defied explanation, holding memory, intention, and some hidden knowledge. I realized then that the midwives had not merely tended to plants, they had tended to something sentient, a living archive of life, death, and the forest itself. The fog thickened as I stepped back, and the forest seemed to respond. Shadows stretched longer, twisting toward me, bending around roots and stones. The subtle humming of the root became more pronounced, a vibration in the ground that almost matched my heartbeat. Every step I took was measured, careful, yet the forest seemed to adjust to my movements, guiding me toward the center. I could sense presence in the periphery of my vision, shapes kneeling, tending unseen fires, their faces obscured beneath hoods. They moved without sound, appearing and disappearing in a rhythm that I could not comprehend. I realized the forest had not forgotten the midwives, and perhaps it had never forgiven those who failed to respect its secrets. A rustle to my right. I froze. Something brushed against the fog, deliberate, cautious. My lantern flickered, and in the brief stuttering of light, I could have sworn I saw the reflection of a face, pale and unreadable, staring from the shadows. When the flame steadied, there was nothing, only the silent forest and the pulsing root at the center of the clearing. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet I felt compelled to remain. The root's glow pulsed, faint but insistent, and I understood. It was aware of me. It remembered every intruder, every ritual performed in this clearing, every life it had touched. And now, it had acknowledged me. I knelt once more, feeling the vibration through the soil, the pulse of memory beneath my fingers. The forest whispered in silence, communicating through rustling leaves, shifting fog, and the faint glow that refused to fade. I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer merely a visitor. I was part of a story that had been written for centuries, and the consequences were yet to reveal themselves. As I lingered at the edge of the clearing, the forest began to shift around me, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. The fog thickened into rolling tendrils that crept along the forest floor, curling around roots, clinging to the stone circles, and brushing against my legs. Every sound I made, a step on wet leaves, the rustle of my coat, was echoed back at me in uneven rhythm, as if the forest itself was replaying my movements, testing me. Branches arched and twisted overhead, forming shapes that resembled hands reaching, not toward the sky, but toward me. I tried to focus on the root at the center of the clearing, its glow faint but persistent. Yet my attention was constantly pulled to the edges of the lantern's light, where shapes formed and disappeared. There were no faces I could discern, only the suggestion of figures kneeling, tending fires that were never lit, performing rituals that were suspended in time. The vibration beneath my feet grew stronger, subtle at first, like the heartbeat of the earth, then gradually more insistent. It traveled up through my legs, through my chest, and finally into my skull. The forest was aware of my presence, and it was responding. It was acknowledging me, testing me, warning me, and perhaps even inviting me. I did not know whether to feel honored or terrified. And then I noticed something strange in the mist, small, glowing fragments drifting through the air. They were not fireflies, not sparks, but fragments of some energy I could not name. They hovered briefly, moving with purpose, as if leading me somewhere. The hairs on my arms rose, my pulse quickened, and I realized that the forest, the root, and whatever force lingered in the fog were not passive. They were alive, attentive, and patient. They remembered every hand that had reached for the root, every incantation whispered over the soil, and now they were aware of me. As I stepped closer, following the drifting fragments of light, I felt it, a presence brushing against the edge of perception, neither fully seen nor imagined. The fog curled tighter around my boots, my legs, as if guiding me toward the center. And then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood or bone, echoing faintly from all directions. I froze. The tapping grew in intensity, layered with whispers I could not decipher, spoken in a language I did not know yet somehow understood. It was not a voice in words, but a voice in intention, an awareness pressing against my mind. The forest, the root, and the lingering spirits of those midwives were all communicating at once. I had crossed into something that existed beyond reason or daylight. In the corner of my eye, a shadow moved, kneeling near a circle of herbs. I blinked, and it vanished. I took another step, and there it was again, kneeling at the opposite side of the clearing, always just beyond clarity. I realized then that I was witnessing a ritual frozen in time. Perhaps they were aware of me. Perhaps they were reenacting something meant to test my resolve. Every instinct told me to leave, yet curiosity, wild, reckless curiosity, kept me rooted in place. The root pulsed again, this time stronger, and I felt it in my chest, in my hands, even in the tips of my fingers. Its energy was not violent, not aggressive, but alive, conscious, aware of me. I could sense memories embedded within it. Centuries of ritual, the intent of the midwives, the lives that had been touched, altered, or ended because of it. I knelt closer, careful not to disturb the soil. The vibration under my palms seemed to resonate with my heartbeat, a slow but unyielding rhythm that demanded attention. I realized the root was not merely a plant. It was a living archive, a witness, a judge. And now it had observed me. At that moment, the forest fell almost silent. Even the creek's murmur softened to a whisper. The mist thickened into walls around me, and the soft glow from the root cast long, twisting shadows across the blackened stones and arranged herbs. For the first time, I understood why the midwives had gone to such lengths to protect it. Its power was not just legend. It was awareness, memory, and perhaps judgment. I could feel its influence stretching outward, shaping the forest, touching the fog, bending the perception of light and shadow. Shapes moved just beyond the edges of my vision, indistinct yet purposeful. I realized that curiosity had drawn me here, but the forest, the root, and the spirits had now marked me as part of their story. There was no casual departure. Once you touched the root, you were forever a participant in its memory. The forest seemed to breathe with me, drawing in and exhaling slowly, measuring, waiting. Every leaf that shivered in the wind, every branch that creaked, every distant ripple on the creek felt deliberate, as though the entire environment was communicating, subtly, insistently. My pulse raced, yet I remained, unwilling to step back, unwilling to ignore the depth of what I was witnessing. I whispered to the fog, almost involuntarily, "What is this place? What do you want from me?" There was no answer in words, only sensation. The subtle pulsing under my hands, the gentle tug of the mist at my legs, and the fleeting impression of figures kneeling, bowing, acknowledging me as one who had entered their secret. It was a warning. It was an invitation, and it was alive. I understood then that some forces are not bound by logic, not contained by time. The root had endured centuries, preserved by rituals, fear, and reverence, and now it was aware of me. I was no longer an observer. I had become part of its history, its memory, its vigilance, and whether I left or stayed, I would never be free of its influence. As I knelt closer to the forbidden root, I felt the air thicken around me, pressing in like water in a submerged cave. The glow from its surface pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and every pulse carried the weight of centuries. Rituals performed, lives altered, secrets guarded. It was as if the root itself were aware, observing me not as a visitor, but as a participant in a story that had long been written. The mist rose in curling tendrils, wrapping around the stones and herbs, flowing over the blackened earth. I could see shapes kneeling at the edges of the clearing, their forms shifting, never fully revealed. Their presence was a reminder that the midwives had never acted alone. The forest itself had remembered, and it continued to watch, to guard, and to judge. I traced my fingers along the twisted root. The vibrations beneath my touch grew stronger, resonating through my arms, chest, and skull. I felt memories of those who had handled it before me. The apprentice who vanished for 3 days and returned with eyes that reflected knowledge no human should bear. The villagers who had whispered warnings to their children about the power buried in Hollow Creek. The root carried every story, every act of reverence, every mistake. And now it had added me to its memory. As I rose, the forest seemed to respond. Branches arched and shifted subtly. The fog thickened and twisted like it had intent, and I could feel the roots' energy weaving through the mist, connecting stone, herb, and soil in a lattice of unseen power. The tapping sound returned, softer now, more deliberate, echoing across the clearing, in a rhythm that my mind could almost follow. Then, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, brushed my ear. Not a word I could recognize, but a sound imbued with meaning. It resonated with the rhythm of the root, and I realized that the forest, the root, and the spirits of the midwives were communicating. I was no longer merely observing. I was part of a conversation that spanned decades, carried in soil and stone, fog and root, memory and pulse. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision. Kneeling figures, shadows bending around tree trunks, limbs swaying as though alive. The pulsing root guided them subtly, their movements synchronized with its rhythm. I realized that the rituals were not just protective or medicinal. They were integrative, binding the living, the dead, and the forest together into a single, breathing entity. I stepped carefully along the edge of the clearing, every footfall measured, but the forest seemed to adjust to my presence, responding in ways that were both subtle and deliberate. A twig snapped to my right. I froze. In the brief pause, I thought I saw a figure kneeling, bowing toward the root, then vanishing when my eyes adjusted. The root pulsed again, brighter this time, and I felt a vibration through the soles of my feet. It was a sensation deeper than fear, more profound than awe, a reminder that the earth itself held memory, and that memory had now recorded me. I thought of the midwives, their apprentices, the villagers who had walked these paths before me. They had all interacted with this root, and the forest remembered every gesture. And then I realized the forest itself was alive with their presence. Shapes moved in the fog, unseen yet deliberate. Branches arched overhead as though observing, and the mist pressed closer. The air hummed faintly with energy. I could feel that curiosity was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the root, to the forest, and to the spirits who had walked here long before me. As I finally turned to leave the clearing, the forest seemed to stretch unnaturally around me. The fog thickened at the edges of my vision, curling into shapes that reminded me of kneeling figures. The root's glow dimmed slightly, but its presence lingered in every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every breath of wind. I felt awe and terror in equal measure. The forest, the root, and the spirits of the midwives had observed me, recorded me, and acknowledged my intrusion. There was no casual exit. I had become part of the memory, and whether I returned to the village or walked away forever, the root would carry my presence forward, a new chapter in its long-enduring history. Even now, decades later, I feel it, the pull of that clearing, the whisper of the fog, the pulse of the root. Some nights, I wake to a memory that is not mine alone, to a rhythm beneath the earth that resonates with something older than life, older than memory itself. I whisper a warning now, not just to myself, but to anyone who might listen. The forest waits. The root remembers. Curiosity draws you closer, and once you reach that clearing, once you kneel before the forbidden root, you are forever a part of it. Would you step into the fog and risk what the forest holds? Would you touch what remembers everything and leave a piece of yourself behind? Some stories are not merely told. They are lived, remembered, carried forward. And perhaps, if you close your eyes tonight, you might hear the tapping in the distance, the rustle of roots beneath the soil, and the pulse of a root that never forgets. Some say the forest still remembers every name, every step, every whisper spoken near that root. And if you listen closely on quiet nights, you might hear the same pulse beneath your feet. If you made it this far, you're one of the few brave enough to stay until the end. Tell me, would you touch the root if you found it? Or would you walk away before it remembered you too? Until next time, keep your lanterns lit and your curiosity just out of reach. Subscribe to Dark Room of Whispers for more videos like this.